When I was growing up, we weren't an angry family, which is to say that nobody ever displayed anger. Well, that's not quite true, but there was the unspoken rule that displaying any kind of anger was bad. This hasn't necessarily served me in that good a stead because, if I'm honest, I would say that I have always been and remain pretty conflict averse. I don't like arguments. I don't like disagreeing with people. I don't like rows. And to be honest, I've never been very good at them. I said it wasn't quite true that nobody ever displayed anger. When I was a youngish teenager, I think I must have been, disagreeing about something with my dad. Presumably, I think for a while, because one afternoon, I think it was a Sunday afternoon, I was just chatting to my mum in the dining room, and my dad walked in and said, "I really can't believe how you make me feel," and picked up one of the dining chairs and just smashed it. And this was shocking, astonishing. This kind of thing doesn't happen. And then walked out again. And I don't think any more was ever said about this. Whew. And of course, these days, if you have angry outbursts, you might consider going on some kind of anger management course. And obviously, working in prisons, a lot of the people that I've met there are there basically because they had problems managing their anger. They would hurt people, sometimes excessively so. What's actually happening with our anger? Why was anger difficult for me when it wasn't causing a problem? And I think I would have said that would have been a complete lie, that I was one of those people who just didn't get angry. But of course I did. When I got angry, I really didn't know what to do with it. I'd get really upset. Start having reactions which really seemed to be more traumatic than rational. Clearly, just the experience of getting angry tied into, I might say pushed my buttons, tied into all kinds of experiences which I wasn't very good at holding. Would it be fair to say that we're afraid of feeling anger, or many of us are afraid of feeling anger? I don't mean exclusively that, because, and I'll come back to this, in some ways the experience of feeling anger is glorious. In some ways, I think we feel most ourselves when we're carried away by anger. That kind of self-possession and self-righteousness. I never feel more separate. I never feel more me in that sense than when I'm experiencing real anger. But there clearly is a connection between anger and fear. Maybe pretty much all anger is driven by fear. We could actually say it's displaced fear. I don't know what to do with the fear. I can't really cope with the fear. And of course, fear itself ties in with shame, doesn't it? So I can't cope with the shame. I don't know what to do with these feelings. I really cannot bear to feel these feelings, so let's get rid of them. And the way to get rid of them is always through some kind of action. Anger clearly is a tension, really serious tension. Tension in the quite literal sense, held in our bodies. And we all know those kind of anger reactions. The pulse, the breathing, the way the blood flows. Tension, muscles clench. They need release. And so the easiest form of release is action, muscular action, reflex. So I think anger can be in a response to what we perceive as a threat, or even kind of fear of anger in itself. It's where we don't want to go. As I say, fear, shame, these places we really don't want to go. And we can slide those into anger. And once they manifest as anger, well, that's tension that can be discharged. And we can act that out of ourselves. It's so easy. Release. And it doesn't even have to be hitting anybody. It could be pressing hard on the accelerator. It could be any number of actions which will just engage that release. Of course, I might act it out on myself. I can call myself names. I can lambast myself. I can actually, physically attack myself. I've known young men punch walls. I've known, well, obviously, in prison you come across quite a lot of self-harm. But of course either of those reactions were immediately into the territory of dissociation, myself from myself. There's me here, hating me there. You fool, you idiot, how could you? And of course, displaced fear, shame, anger, it's always looking for a soft target. And actually, I'm a pretty soft target for my own anger like that. Or of course I can try and send it inwards, can't I? Damp it down, repress it, turn away for a bit in that way. But whatever I'm doing here, I'm turning away from my anger. Saying, I can't go there. Don't want to go there. Let alone the places that are bringing that anger into being in the first place. Now, traditionally, of course, Buddhism has a fairly consistent line on anger. Mostly. Anger is bad. Anger is separation. Anger is delusion. Anger is intoxication. Anger is mindlessness, heedlessness, the opposite of equanimity, the opposite of control. And it has to be said that a lot of traditional Buddhist practice with anger is really around coping strategies. How do I get away from this anger in the moment? And there are many of these. Not going to go into any of them here. And what's different about ordinary mind from most of these, and other teachers go to some of these places, and fantastic that they do. But if the core of the practice that Joko developed is not turning away, is being with whatever is in this moment, is owning this anger, I might say being this anger, not as some kind of detached observer, but as actually being this embodiment, being the muscle tension, being the need to release, being the desire to shout, being whatever form it actually takes in me. But because this is practice, I'm not going to release that tension by acting out. I'm not going to punch the wall. I'm not going to punch anybody else. If I'm going to insist on calling myself a name, I'm going to go calling myself a name. Back to the practice. It's a very different approach. So of course, if we don't practice with this anger, and again, if we're acting out, we're still turning away from it. We're just going, no, push it away. Whether that's pushing my fist into somebody's face and disconnecting from the actual experience of the anger, or whether I'm going, I'm not angry, or whether I'm going, Om Mani Padme Hum, or, distracting myself in a number of ways. That's still not being with, that's still not experiencing, that's still not being this anger. And what do we find when we stay with anything? We find that if we don't keep stoking it, it burns. And it may burn clean and process itself. It may just burn and transform into another emotion, another feeling. We may have to do this many, 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 many times. But we see and we experience how it changes, because anger is just one more resistance to our life as it is. One more point where I can pick up my practice. One more point where I can connect with being this body, being these emotions, being these thoughts in this situation. Being not separate from this anger. Not dissociating, not splitting myself in two. Because this is what we tend to do. Split, dissociate, separate out. Because we're not practicing a full awareness. To go back to the images that I've been playing with in the last few talks, we can kind of be aware of anger as the elephant in the room. The thing that means you and I are not talking, or snapping at each other, or he's off in a huff in a corner, and I can be aware of that, but actually, what if the elephant of anger, of suffering, because anger is always just a symptom, an expression of our suffering, whether we're calling that fear, trauma, whatever. It's that in my own life which I cannot face, that which I cannot be with. And we get angry because we've touched into those deeper layers. But what if the elephant is actually an iceberg? What if we're only seeing that much of it? Even catching sight of it out the corner of our eye. If we turn towards it, we may well find that actually we're only seeing that much of it. We're not seeing the huge mass of suffering, of frozen emotion, frozen attitudes, frozen thoughts that's actually tying into. And part of that's going to go down into some of the, earlier, deeper layers of ourself, and a lot of that's going to go sideways out to everybody else's frozen suffering, the way that these things connect up. Some of the ways I was beginning to talk about last week. Too often we tend to see things that kind of cut off at the waterline and just not notice, not allow our awareness to develop more understanding of what lies beneath. What does lie beneath? Well, our own fear, our own layers of shame, but also the way that those connect up with everybody else's. Not just as individuals, but as the way our culture expresses it. The way I am shamed as a man, or shamed as a woman, or shamed because I'm gay, or shamed because I'm whatever. This mass, this iceberg of suffering. Kind of finished last week with that Joko quote about the psychologically mature person meets injustice with opposition, with anger and opposition, and the spiritually mature person meets injustice with compassion. And I said, what actually can we mean by that? And I thought it's interesting that in her book on the precepts, Waking Up to What We Do, Diane Rossetto makes a distinction between what we might call selfish anger and what she's calling life-affirming anger, which is anger, you might say, in the cause of the greater good. She takes the example of somebody whose child was killed on the roads, I think by a drunken driver, but they died through negligent driving. And they went away and founded an organisation which promotes and teaches children about and campaigns for road safety. And that's obviously channeling that kind of resulting anger, not disallowing its connection with grief, allowing its connection with grief and producing something positive. Rossetto also talks about the famous, I've heard it from several different sources, I have no idea about the reality of the situation. They, as a grown-up, an older person, Joko was walking on the beach and saw two young men fighting, really having a go at each other. And Joko just, in the moment, rushes over to them and yells, "Stop!" Pulls them apart. And they look kind of shamefaced about being basically told what's what by this older lady. And they go their separate ways, and that's the end of it. And that's, I'm sure Joko would say, it's about the anger of the moment, real anger, not what the Buddhists call prapancha, not ruminating, not, stoking. And as I've said, if we fail to stoke our anger, if we fail to keep feeding it, obviously what's the easiest way we keep feeding it is just tell ourselves how wronged we've been, tell ourselves how much in the right we are, and go round and round and round the circles like that. So I thought it'd be interesting to begin to talk about anger. This whole precept about anger, the ninth precept, sometimes expressed as do not be angry, sometimes expressed as do not hold on to anger. And there's that idea there about the experience of anger and owning our experience of anger is probably inevitable. The question is what we do with it. Do we feed it and love it and look after and grow it? Or do we allow it to burn through us? Possibly with an appropriate action, possibly just on the cushion. So am I free of anger? Well, to be honest, I have a pretty okay life, personally. There are things which are annoying. I wouldn't say there's much in my life I get that angry about. That could change in an instant, obviously. Something happens. How do I respond? Well, quite possibly with anger. Do I feel anger about the past? Well, yeah, actually, sometimes, some moments, I'm mad as hell about my dad. The Incredible Hulk cartoon, and these days the Marvel movies, this giant green unstoppable force of anger. Well, some days I could show him a thing or two, but that's okay. I don't feel any need to be run by that. I don't feel any need to live my life according to that. That's just part of me, and that's okay. What does get me angry? Well, it probably does come back to what it's the sheer insanity of injustice. Why? Why would we allow the full scope, the full insanity of this to exist when we are rational-ish, kind-ish, human, hopefully, beings? We don't have to live this way. We don't have to live as men and women in separate silos or dominating each other. We don't have to see everything as a competition. We don't have to think that some of us are so much better than others. We don't have to think that some of us are entitled to so much more than others. And yet we seem to live this way. The fact that we do makes me angry. And what do I do about it? What would I do if we were sat in sesshin together in our special space, beautifully so, and Donald Trump walks through the door? I don't know. Maybe I'll leave you with that image.